Welcome once again to this lesson. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about the HTML input form attribute. We did discuss the HTML input attributes in the previous lesson, and we are going to be specifically talking about those that we define for the form itself. So let's dive right into that. So again, in this lesson, we are going to talk about the different form attributes for the HTML input element. So the first attribute that we want to look at is the form attribute itself. So let's take an example, which is always the best way to look at this. So let's write our HTML from scratch. Okay, I have my doc type, and then I have my HTML, and then I have my body, and then let's put it on H1. I'm going to say form attributes. Okay, and then let's just put in the form, right? So we have a form, and then uh, let's just put a label in here. So we are creating a simple form, right? So we're gonna call it first name, right? And then let's put an input. In this input, we're gonna have a type of text. And if you haven't watched the previous lesson, this may be the time to go watch because we have talked about the various types of input types that we have. So I'm gonna have an ID of say F name, first name, and a name of I'm gonna call it the same name, F name. Okay, maybe I would wanna use the for attribute here. Oops, I just for and this label is for what? This input type with an ID called F name. Okay, so we have this, right? So if I refresh this, you have form attributes and you have first name and first name. Good. Now, what the form attribute is, it's that it specifies the form that the uh, inputs of the form belong to. So all these uh, all these inputs here belong to this form, right? So you can have multiple inputs and they all belong to this form, right? So the value of this attribute is always equal to the ID attribute of the form. So what we can do is that we can set an ID here and maybe call it first form, right? So that is the ID that we have set for this form. So all these inputs belong to the form with ID first form, right? And maybe you can have an action attribute here and I'm gonna call maybe a random value of maybe test dot php or whatever. Okay, so we have a sample form here. So if we wanted to associate other inputs to this, right? Uh, let's just, for the sake of it, the form end here, but I'm gonna just create a label and I'm gonna say it's for an input that I'm gonna call L name leader, right? Which just stands for last name, right? And then maybe I need a colon here just to make it readable. Okay, and then I'm gonna have the actual input type is equal to, I'm gonna make it text, same as and the ID here should be L name, last name, and I'm gonna have the name equal to L name, and then the name of the form this belongs to. So I'm gonna say form is equal to, so this is the form attribute, right? And I'm gonna have a value of the same form, which is called first form. So I'm gonna define it this way, first form, right? And I'm gonna close this and have this input. So if I refresh this, you have your last name and then you have your first name, and they all belong to the same form. So that is the first form attribute that we are gonna study, and we have already had this as an example, so we all know what it is now. And that is the form attribute, right? Let's look at another type of attribute that we looked at, but we are gonna look at it again, and we're gonna call it the form action attribute. And this input form action attribute specifies the URL of the file that will process the input. So this action attribute here, and the URL that you put in this action, the value of this action is the URL of the file that's going to process this form. So it's usually going to be a uh, back end file, PHP, Django, anything that any of the technologies you want to use to process this form is the URL that you're going to put here. So that is what the action is. So I'm not going to talk about it again, as we've used it over and over again in our previous examples, right? And the other one that we want to look at is called the form enctype attribute. And what this form enctype attribute specifies is how the form data should be encoded when it's submitted. And it's only used for forms with method post, and we'll see why that is the case later on. So this attribute overrides the encrypt attribute of the form element. So we use it when we want to specify how the form data should be encoded and submitted, right? So the form enctype attribute works with input types submit and image. And let's look at an example of this. So I'm gonna just break this line here, and then, like I said, it works with the form with method post. So I'm gonna first put the method, set it to post, right? And then I'm gonna have an input type, input. I'm gonna call this, the type of this should be submit. And then I'm gonna have a value of submit. Okay. And what I'm gonna do again is create another input type, which is also gonna be of type submit, small letter. And I'm gonna have the form enc type, and I'm gonna set this to multi form data, multi-part form data, right? And I'm gonna have a value, and I'm gonna set this to multi-part slash form data. Okay, and then we close this. Okay, so here we have the input form enctype attribute specifies how the form data should be encoded when it's submitted, right? And like I said, it's only for forms with the method post. If you put method get, it doesn't work with that. So be sure to always use it for the form post, right? So I'm gonna refresh this, and I'm gonna have this two values, submit and multi-part. So if I click submit here, Matthew Smith, submit, and submit multi-part. So there you have it. And I see why the error is, because this is outside of the form. So either you use the form attribute, or a better way to do it would be just to put it inside the form. So I'm going to do this, right? And then when I refresh it, I have the submit. And so when I submit this, it doesn't submit any data. So I'm just going to do this. When I submit it, file couldn't be processed, right? So that is how this works, right? If I use the submit multi-part form data, and the reason why this page is because there's no file called test.php to handle your form request, and that's why it's like this. But if you did have a test.php which is going to handle your form, it should be able to see it. So it kind of like encodes it and makes it safer to transmit. So yeah. So that is the form enctype attribute. Now let's look at the form method attribute we just used. I'm gonna go back, and the form input form method attribute defines the HTTP method for sending form data to the action URL. So in this case, our action URL is test.php, which doesn't exist. We're just using it as a test. And it defines what type of HTTP method or protocol or whatever you want to use to send this data to the URL in the form action attribute. So this attribute overrides the method attribute of the form element, right? So the form element has a method attribute, and so what this form method does is it overrides whatever you have put in there. So the form method attribute works with the following types, right? Input types, which is the submit and then the image, right? So again, you can see here that we have a method uh, attribute which is part of the form uh, element, right? So which is we set it to post, but we also have a form method attribute, and whatever you put in there is it's gonna override this method that you've already defined here, right? So the form data can be sent as URL variables using method is equal to get, or as method is equal to post. So for the get method, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about that. This method, what it does, it appends the form data to the URL in the name, right? So you can see this is post, right? If I refresh this, and then let's say I put in here and I submit this, you don't see any of the data being appended to the URL, right? But if I change this to get and I refresh this and we go back and I submit this, you can see that the data is appended to the URL. So it's not secure to be putting your data as part of your URL, right? So that is another thing, right? So the method, and that is the get method, is useful for form submissions where a user wants to maybe bookmark the results, right? So whatever it is, the user want to bookmark the result so you can use it. And there is a limit to how much data you can pass in a URL. So you cannot pass a bunch of, there's always going to be a limit. And this is browser specific. So every browser have a limit that you can use to pass data, right? So it's not advisable to use gets method to pass sensitive information. So if you have credit card information, even your date of birth, your whatever personal details about yourself, passwords, it's not advisable. It's you should never actually. It's a never to use the get method. You can use the post method as it has these values, right? The post method also uh, is sends data via HTTP post transaction, right? And it cannot be bookmarked, so you cannot bookmark these submissions, right? And the post method is a little bit more robust. It's robust and it's secure, right? And we looked at why it's secure because it does not expose your data, right? And it also has it doesn't have that size limitation that the get method has, right? So let's look at this. So the easy thing about this is it's not that difficult. It's just you have your submit, and I'm gonna create some more space here. So you have your submit here, and what you can do with this is you can now have your attribute that we are gonna call form method, and then we are gonna name this maybe posts or gets, right? So this is gets at the form level, but this input type submit is having a form method that says post. So if I go back, let me refresh this, and then I say this, you can see even though there's a get method here which is supposed to expose my variables, it is not doing it because it's actually overriding the get with the post, right? Because we actually said that ignore whatever I wrote here and use the method get, right? So that is what you can do with this attribute. And also we have the form target attribute, and the input form target attribute specifies a name or a keyword that indicates where to display the response that is received after submitting the form, right? So we talked about a few when we looked at the form lesson, but it's also the same. We can tag it, uh, we can set it as blank, right? If you wanted it to be on the same page, right? So, and the way we do that also is the same, right? We can also use the form target here, and then set it to any of our target options. And I'm just gonna use blank for now, right? For now. So you can do this. So we can override that, and we can put it right in the input. So if I go back and then I try to submit, it opens in a new tab, right? So if you had put self, it's gonna open. If you had put parent, it has the way. Oh, so it's the same options as the attribute for the form itself. So you should be aware, right? So when I use the target is the blank, it opens a new blank tab and then puts your response in there, as you can see, right? So that is the target. And now we also have the form no validate attribute, right? And the form no validate attribute specifies that an input element should not be validated, right? So this attribute overrides the no validate attribute of the form element. So we talked about the form in the form lesson, we talked about the no validate form attribute. Now this also overrides that value. So uh, if you wanted to have it not, and I'm gonna just drop this down so I have space, right? I could just put in here form no validate. So don't validate the form, right? And I'm gonna put form no va. Yep. So form no validate, right? So this overrides the no validate of the form element, right? So if I had put no validate here, this overrides it. So this also works the same way. So I'm just gonna skip it because we talked about it. And then we have the no validate attributes, right? And this is a form attribute that we talked about, and that's what I was referencing to. So with that one, the form itself has no validate here. And I just wanna, right? And this no validate form no validate overrides this attribute that you have put in here, right? And then we can also have so we talked about the no validate as being a two-way thing. You can decide to put it in the form attribute itself or in the input type form attribute. Uh, but always know that when you put it in the input type form attribute here, like form no validate, it always overrides whatever you put in the form attribute itself. So be very careful. So there are times you just skip it and you don't realize that that's what's causing the issue. So yeah. So that I think we've spoken about most of the uh, input form attributes that there is. And you can always look in double three schools online to check if you want to use something that we've not talked about. But yeah, most of the information that we have, you find it in double three schools. So thank you for watching. See you in the next lesson.